Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Chloe Lee, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to Following the Thread, Creative Responses to the Archive with artist and integrative arts counsellor Michelle Rodrigues. This event is part of our Methodologies series, where we've brought together researchers and practitioners, each of whom in different ways engages creatively with archives and archival material. Through this programme, we're also encouraging you, the audience, to engage with our collections in new and innovative ways, to explore the possibilities for creative collaborations, and to consider methodologies and practices that reach beyond traditional academic practice and outputs. In this session today, myself and colleague Iqbal will be in conversation with Michelle Rodrigues, who hosted the Golden Thread Weekend at the National Archives in July of this year. Before we get started, just some housekeeping to bear in mind. The session is about an hour long and we'll finish at 2 p.m. UK time. We may get cut off a bit abruptly, so forgive us in advance if that does happen. The event is being run through Zoom webinar, meaning that you can submit any questions you have to our panelists via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You could do this at any point of the session and we'll come back to them during the Q&A. My colleagues, the National Archives admin team, Molly and Ellen, who are behind the scenes today, are going to be sharing some guidance about that Q&A function if you do have any issues. And if you do need any technical support today during this event, please do reach out to us via the chat and we'll try to assist you in the best way that we can. Just so you know that this event is being recorded today, and we've also enabled live captions. You can access those at the bottom of your screen by clicking live transcript, show subtitle, or alternatively, if you prefer to hide those, if you find them distracting, then it's the exact same process. So without further ado, I think we're going to kick off with a video to give you a bit of insight about the Golden Thread project here at the National Archives. And then I think Iqbal is going to tell us the story of the project and give you a bit of insight if you're a bit unfamiliar. So Michelle, I'm going to turn off my screen. I don't know if you're able to share that video for us, please.
I was born in Hammersmith in the early 1970s. Both of my parents were immigrants, my mother from Grenada in the Caribbean and my father from Goa. Neither parent spoke about where they were from or how they came to be here. So I grew up with a confused sense of identity, not really knowing anything about my ancestry or the past. When my father was dying, he was in Charing Cross Hospital in Hammersmith, and it struck me as significant that he was leaving in the same place that I came in, and yet I knew so little about his story. With my father gone, I turned to his oldest brother, Salu, to try and fill in some of the gaps. It struck me that the information he held within him, the stories, would be the only bridges I'd have to answer some of the unknown. The River Thames is a tidal water body governed by rhythmic movement, draw and pull, ebb and flow. And the very nature of tides is the covering over and the revelation. To wash up what was once lost and hidden at depth. As an adult, I learned that both of my maternal great-grandparents were Indian, and it raised questions for me as to how they came to be in the Caribbean. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I learned something of the story of Indian indentureship. What struck me when I first came to the National Archives was that this building housed the story of a nation that was once an empire that was once a colonizing force, and that the narrative preserved here told the story from only one vantage point. Yet within these carefully collected, preserved and guarded relics of history, inadvertently they also hold traces of untold stories, of those not given a voice. One needs to approach what is held here with the eyes of someone who is seeking out those stories, searching for traces of their unknown past. One of the definitions of an archive is that archives are distinguished from documents that have been consciously written or created to communicate a particular message to posterity. In other words, archives are collections of ephemera brought together to tell a story. How do we archive what is held within us? Hold space for and value the ephemeral and the transient, the remnants and the fragments of our stories.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. I think that video really captures some of the essence of the weekend that was held at the National Archives in July for a little group of us exploring some things together alongside some records. Iqbal, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the story of the project, and I'll share our presentation so we can show some photos.
Thank you, Chloe, and I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, I mean, if you can just share the slide, Chloe, and I'll take the audience through some of what led us to the Golden Threads weekend. So really, this is all part of a bigger program that we've been developing for a number of years now under a kind of grand title of Archives and Emotions, and started really in June 2019 with a pilot workshop at Still Point Spaces London. We were working on particularly Caribbean history, Black British Caribbean history, around the theme of racism past and present with the poetry therapist Charmaine Pollard. And that was growing into a new project that led to us doing something on Indian indenture. These two strands became in some ways the tram lines around which we were exploring this story of archives and emotions. And its genesis, if I can just take us a step back, kind of comes from my own interaction with the archive. I joined in 2015, and in 2017 we were marking the partition of British India and its independence. And I was very struck by the records that I was looking at that kind of spoke to my own heritage background, a Sikh mother and a Muslim father, and the kind of issues that had come out of partition. And looking at some of the archives, I literally started to cry. And those tears, I think, have been translated into this kind of project. And so, as I was saying, in 2019, we started with these twin projects. I wanted to see if it was just not me and how others would also explore their own histories and heritages. And so in 2019, we did the project with Still Point, and then later on, we developed a project on Indian indenture. And that led to an anthology that we produced, and we had a big launch event on the 25th of March. And part of that team, we had Michelle as part of that small group, and Gina Agnew was using creative writing as a way of getting us to sort of think about our own stories. And in many ways, that was the kind of background to how the link came with Michelle, who had written some extraordinary pieces in her sharings with us, particularly about ancestral voice. And it's really been that which I think has led us to this particular phase. There are other phases as well that we're looking to develop around archives and emotions. And as I've said here, it's exploring this intersection between archival records, memory, and transnational histories. Very much an ongoing program of work that we're looking to do. If you can go to the next slide, I think we might have jumped. And so we haven't, and I'll take us back. This was the actual day that we. No problem, Chloe, don't worry. I'll just take people through. So Michelle and I met in June last year. We developed our ideas in November of last year. We looked at the records that we'd like to explore. And then really from this year, we've been developing a lot of the ideas that led to this, what we've called the Golden Thread weekend, 13th and 14th of July of 2024. So a long gestation period, lots of thought, lots of care, lots of time taken to bring us to the point where we were able to invite a small group of people into the National Archives. And as you can see here, the 13th and 14th was structured with Michelle very much guiding us, thinking about how we would arrive, there'd be some kind of group circle, some contracting, we would be looking at National Archives records, there'd be a break. And then this thing of personal artifacts, something that Michelle has brought in with her practice to get people to be thinking about their own personal stories, and something that was covered slightly in her video. And then a chance later on to do some mark making and doing some art-based practice. And the second day allowed more time for this. I think, Chloe, you can now take us through some of the photos just to give people a sense of what happened over that weekend. Here's Chloe in action, showing off some of our records with some of the members of the group who attended. And there was a number of opportunities for people to look at Caribbean history over the last 250 years. Again, just fragments, just moments in that history, but really drawing in the kind of cosmopolitan, diverse nature of the Caribbean's history. And Michelle had done some amazing work in setting up the room, using some of the kind of materials that are very associated with the trade and story of empire. And that in itself was very meaningful, I think, for a lot of people. And as you can see, we had a room set up, really done nicely. Michelle, again, had taken a lot of care and time to think about making the experience really meaningful for the 11 or 12 participants who took part. Again, more shots of the materials that we used. And then some of the outputs, I mean, these are just little things that were created, but they were very meaningful, I know, for many of those who took part. Different ways in which they were allowed to use mixed media, allowed to kind of chat and talk amongst each other, but also kind of produce work. And Michelle had brought some sort of cutouts, some other materials that people could use, and really encouraging this exploration that was really, really beautiful. And I think the fruit of that, I think, will come in a few moments when you see a photo of the group. So these are, again, some more items that were produced. And then here, this photo, I think we all really universally loved this photo, a very natural sense of the group, all coming together right at the end of the 2 days, a real testament to the ability of Michelle and the team to bring everyone together, and a real testament to how the team, how the participants themselves also gave so much of themselves. And the final, I think, was a group photo here. And that also to be, you know, with some of the artwork, and everyone really kind of, you know, just engaged and really moved, I think. And it was a very soulful experience for all of us that were involved. And then just quickly on the evaluation, we had over 40 applications for limited spaces. We had, as I say, about 11 or 12 people. All scored it 5 out of 5. Words to describe the workshop: creative, colourful, inspirational, moving, attention to detail, cathartic, fulfilled, expansive, unity, diverse, connectivity. Lots of really powerful words used. And really the learnings were that there were others out there with whom I could share thoughts and feelings. That was a very important takeaway for a lot of people, just being able to be mirrored and seen. I was reminded there's more that connects us, and it's always important to remember that. And that many of us are dealing with these issues of identity and belonging. And I learned the names of people that I'd never met before, and I learned that I really love to engage in active artwork. And I think that's testament to Michelle's amazing work on that weekend. So that's lots from me. I'll hand over to Chloe.
Thanks, Iqbal. I think that's really helpful to kind of think about the timeline, but I'm also aware that we want to get into this conversation with Michelle.
Yeah.
I wonder, Michelle, if you could perhaps introduce yourself a little bit, but also maybe talk to this idea of the golden thread and what that means to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, so the golden thread, I think, kind of arose through this idea of story. And I guess for me, it's like a reference to the storyline that runs through all of our lives, you know, irrespective of whether we turn towards it and even acknowledge it. The fact is that there is this thread that runs through our lives. And that storyline, it's intergenerational and it transcends time. So it travels through the past. It is with us in our lifetime, in our present, but also it extends into the future. So I guess one might refer to it possibly as something that might be soul or spiritual. But I referenced it as golden because there's something very precious about it. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. And I wonder, in the video, we saw some shots of Hammersmith there and you standing by the river, and also, you know, mentioning about your father being in hospital. So we've got these kind of ideas of Hammersmith and home. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more to that for us.
Yeah. I mean, I was born, as I said in the video, I was born in Hammersmith. And when I was 3 years old, I moved away from London, and at the same time also moved away from my wider family, including my father. And I spent most of my life away, traveling, just constantly being uprooted and moving. And so I often would use maps as a way of like remembering where I had been, like trying to find the roads that I lived on, or trying to kind of see where the connection was between places. And so I kind of used maps as a way of locating myself and also feeling like connected to family members or people or places that I actually couldn't be with or in. And so when we were kind of talking about, developing a background to the work, I thought, oh yeah, I really want to do some of the photographs in Hammersmith by the river. And I guess for me, like the river becoming like this symbol, not only of London, but the way it's woven also into the storyline of colonization, of empire, and the connection with the Caribbean. So it just became a really potent symbol, I think, for me. And I think that's the other thing that I would add. Obviously, I mentioned in the film that my father died in Hammersmith. So for me, it kind of became this representative of birth and death and the story that lives somewhere in between. So yeah.
No, that's amazing, Michelle. And I think water, I know when we first met, talking about this project, thinking about the Thames, which is just behind the National Archives, and just really thinking of its presence, I think water, again, really was important in all of this. And that kind of freedom flowing, that ability to move. But I know that there was another moment that me and you had when we were trying to develop the copy for this event. And I think at one point I was trying to kind of box you in a bit, trying to kind of say, so kind of we've got to describe you in a certain way. And I know you were kind of resistant to that, correctly so. And as you've referred to again, this kind of societal need at times to put people into boxes, and how you've resisted this. And I just wanted to understand more about that. I think it was something quite interesting, that kind of moment we had. But I think it's really good to kind of just ask you a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that. Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of speaks to that theme of belonging. And, I think for me, quite often, if I was asked, oh, if you were, in fact, I was asked this, if I was to write a book, what would this kind of definitive book be titled? And it would be called Belonging. And I think for me, because I come from a mixed race background, and because I come from the diaspora on both sides of my family, where there's been a lot of erasure of connection to ancestral past. I guess for me, I don't really know where I belong. I often don't know how to define myself. And so people often want to be very definitive with me and say, oh, you're Indian. Oh, are you Black? Not really sure how to place me. And I think partly because I don't know how to place myself, I am very resistant to being boxed in. And and I think that idea of trying to put people in very neat compartments, I think actually speaks to the legacy of colonization, because when we think about it, it was marked by dividing places. And Iqbal, you spoke to that around partition, and the consequences of when you create a false border or parameter in something that doesn't belong there, what happens around it? And so this whole thing about like splitting and dividing, charting and mapping, like putting something very linear over lives that are fluid, um, becomes a thing. And I think that's echoed because obviously I'm nearly completed my training in arts counselling, so in the therapy side. But even with therapy, like there's often this division between mind and body. And so many things get split off. And so I think I have a very healthy refusal of this kind of need to be very definitive and to get boxed in. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Okay.
Yeah, that's that. No, Michelle, that is really interesting to hear that, and so much of your experience I feel maps onto the feelings that I've had as well. And I wonder, when we are looking at material in the archive, so much of that is disciplined along very kind of I guess organizational structures, right? The way that we navigate the catalogue requires lots of lateral thinking, and it requires you to really kind of approach it in a very methodical way. Okay, so it can kind of mirror that that notion of putting things into boxes, quite literally. And so I wondered for you about the experience that you had in the archive, encountering documents and encountering that kind of way of organizing information and stories, and how that felt.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you don't want to throw the baby away with the bathwater, as they say. And I think there's something really valuable about the ability to take that approach to preserve. One of the things when I came to the National Archives was what really struck me, and it's interesting that I keep using the word strike, that also struck me, that there's this very striking realization, but is that there's so much care that's being put in to the preservation of story. And so without it, all these things would have been lost because, they're fragments, they're letters, they're documents, things that otherwise wouldn't necessarily have a home. And so there's something really important about being able to take that very careful, methodical approach to preserving and collecting and maintaining something. But by the same token, something can also become lost. And so, like, for me, I guess I had hoped, because my ancestry isn't British, and I know that, like, at the National Archives, there's a thing that you have access to something like Find My Past or something, but I knew my past wasn't going to be on there. And so there was this grief of, like, knowing that my history wasn't located in this place, but somehow wanting to have some sort of access to part of the story and how I might get that. So I would get it by looking at Indian indentureship or looking at Caribbean history, knowing that I wasn't going to find my story, but that my story was nonetheless there, if that makes sense. Like, there's aspects of it there. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. And I think that's, I remember many conversations we've had together, talking about these things where you have, I think really highlighted not only the way that the catalogue and now records are kept in a particular way, but I think the other thing which has been really exciting about your practice is the drawing in of the personal archive and that conversation. I mean, we started some of that when we were doing the Indian Indenture project, where people were invited who were part of the group to also bring some of their own items in, to kind of talk to our items, as it were. But I think the way you've elevated that and really drawn that out is a really important part of your practice, and how when we were working on the Saturday, the 13th of July, in the afternoon in particular, people were invited in to kind of bring their items. And having seen sort of the official archive and how immensely moving it was, and for that space to be held, and for that invitation to be given to people to think about those items in relation to, much bigger things. So, really like to just hear more again about some of that and where that's kind of coming from or where that's kind of leading to.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll speak to this invitation to bring an object myself to represent something of my ancestry. And what that did in me was it brought up like this kind of grief, actually, of not feeling like I had anything definitive. And then I guess like this feeling of, oh, what do I have? What can I bring? Like feeling this immense loss that there was nothing. I guess in a way, I wanted something that kind of ticked a box. I wanted something that was very recognizable and definitive to speak for me, and I didn't have such a thing. And so, yeah, when I extended an invitation for people to bring in an artifact, I was very explicit that that could be anything and that there was no right or wrong. And so, like, to kind of expand this idea of what an artifact might be, but an artifact just being an object that that is meaningful. And that meaning is the meaning that we make for something or imbue in something is what's important, as opposed to a collective meaning that people hold. Yeah, sorry, I think I might have just gone slightly off the question.
No, 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 no. I think that's absolutely on question. And I think that this conversation between the personal and the official, I think that that's also something that I think was very striking in terms of how your practice and how you wanted that weekend to be designed. And that I think was very interesting. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that kind of conversation.
Actually, yeah, there is, because in the video I talk about after my father had died, my father didn't speak about his past. And so it was very much almost like this hermetically sealed story that I had no access to. But after he died, I was able to get kind of pieces of the story from his brother. And so like this idea around personal archive, when I asked my uncle to tell me more, I mean, literally we spent the entire day. This was just after the lockdown measures had been lifted. He'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during lockdown, my uncle. And so I kind of felt, oh my God, like there's this really small window of time that I have to meet him face to face and hear his story. And with great delight, he took out like a box file that he had like passports in and his baptism certificate. And it was like being able to take a journey with him into a story that he wanted to tell. But often, who's listening? Like, who's listening? Who wants to hear the stories? And so there's something again about the personal archive being the stories that we hold within us, and taking time to share those and to listen, to witness, people's pasts, and to really partake in the journey, because my uncle then died later that year, and he was the last member of my father's family. And from there on, I've lost access to any of that past because it's not written. And so there's something again around this ephemeral and transient history that is very precious. And so the personal archive could be a tangible object, but it's also the stories that live within us. Yeah.
It reminds me actually, one of our colleagues, Kevin Searle here at the National Archives, brought up I think it's an African proverb: when an elder dies, a whole library burns to the ground. And that feels really pertinent to what you've just spoken to, Michelle. And I wanted to bring up something that just in our own personal communication, we have you have this sign off, Michelle, in your email. Art is not a hiding place, it's a finding place. And I just wanted to ask you about that when it comes to those gaps, absences and silences, and I guess caring and attending to that loss. So I wondered if you could talk more about that and why you feel that is a statement that you want to put out into the world on something as kind of simple as an email sign off.
Yeah, I guess for me, again, I just don't ever really fit into these very neat categories. And although I studied fine art, I guess the way I practice art, I practice it as a way of I don't know. Like, I was going to say like a way of wellness for myself, but it's a place to hold. It's a place to hold and to bridge and to mend and to meet and to, to elevate. But what it hasn't been is a commodity for me. And so I think one of the reasons why it's so important for me to have that as my sign off is that quite often people want to only recognize me as an artist if I'm out there kind of like, oh, where can I see your things? And, are they for sale kind of thing. And if I'm not that kind of artist, then I must just be like some hobby person, in which case it's relegated to, oh, that's just a hobby you do when you retire. But actually, it's a reframing of art being a place that we can find ourselves, and that there's inherent value, as I've spoken to today, with some of the themes that we've touched on, that there's inherent value just in holding art as a space for joining dots, for making connections, for finding things, for preservation, exploration. Yeah.
Yeah, no, very, very powerful reflections. And I mean, one of the things I was very struck by, I mean, this idea of doing group work, working with the group. And that's something that I know, having worked through some of the quite difficult moments early on in the weekend when we were looking at the records, really talking about some quite difficult topics, and then bringing the personal archive and a lot of the memories that was triggering. Then there was this moment towards the end where the invitation was there to do some mark making, to sort of release in a way. But it was the group activity. It wasn't just everyone sent off on their own to do something. We were sitting in tables together. And for me, there was that kind of goosebump moment, which I've kind of reflected on before as well, that moment when the group is just coming together in kind of, there's a kind of union that occurs, an unspoken union. But I'm just really interested in how important groups are in your practice and where that comes in, and not just individuals.
Yeah. Again, you know, thinking about the nature of therapy and where that came in, you know, in the context of humanity, you know, is that we kind of are walking around as individuals, believing that, you know, our problem is individual, that's the way we resolve things. And even, like, for example, I'll digress slightly to talk about CBT, you know, which is the therapy of choice by the National Health, because it's evidence-based. It's an evidence-based practice in therapy. But actually, a lot of what CBT does is individualizes the problem and takes it out of the context of a person's lived experience. And so where I think the group is so important is that it's a place where we can connect, where the focus isn't just on our erroneous experience as an individual, but actually that we come together with whatever is within us and we begin to open up and share, and we realize that actually we're not alone. And I think that is the goosebump moment, is to see ourselves reflected and mirrored in others' experiences, when so much of society kind of, because we're kind of living in these little boxes, we believe that we're just having this experience on our own and that there's something faulty in that. But yeah, when we come together as a group, something of that division comes down. And I think there's real power and beauty in being able to witness ourselves mirrored, like through experience, whether it's through experience or whether it's through some other way within the group. And then how that speaks to my practice. Well, I am very much just coming to the end of my training and about to kind of emerge out into the world. And it is something that's really important to me. Because there's something very powerful in the collective. And, you know, speaking to what Chloe mentioned about that quote around like the loss of a library, there's something about collective experience that is very, very precious and in a sense needs to be reclaimed.
Really,
yeah.
I mean, I just want to say one last thing. I thought very much doing a project focused on the Caribbean, it was quite special to have such diversities in presence with us. This wasn't a sort of a homogenous concept of a Caribbean that maybe gets painted and we're boxed into. And that cosmopolitanism, I think, in group work, it was really, really interesting to witness that. And I was very much with that sense of that rich cosmopolitan aspect of Caribbean history and Caribbean life. So I think it worked on that level as well, really, really interestingly.
Yeah, I agree. It was a really beautiful representation of the Caribbean.
Thank you both for that. And I think maybe if we can maybe move on to some questions, if that's okay, and then maybe some of this, what we've talked about, will come up again. Just to kind of comment for you, Michelle, I think it's Annalisa, apologies if that's me pronouncing that wrong, from Pretoria, South Africa, junior archivist at the Department of Home Affairs. Just wanted to say that they were very motivated and encouraged as someone who wants to do a master's, so some further study in archives. But then perhaps more of a question about your own kind of biography and journey, Michelle. What inspired you to, this doesn't have a name attached, sorry, what inspired you to begin training in arts therapy?
I think mainly to kind of define what art meant to me, because like I said, for me, art wasn't really about this practice of creating commodity. Um, and yeah, and so I guess in a way it was to create a space that I wish had held me, really. You know, sometimes we move into becoming the thing that we wish we had, like, you know. Yeah, and in many respects, like I wish that my art practice, not necessarily to come from a therapeutic place, but to come from a holding place of a finding place, actually, that I wish that my art practice and journey had been kind of grounded in that place. Yeah.
And I think that kind of speaks to those moments in the kind of messy sessions during over the course of the weekend, because there's obviously that initial thing, especially when you get kind of some adults in a room about perfectionism and making something that you could, you know, really kind of be perfect with it. And, you know, but actually you really encouraged us to kind of make marks, so hold space, be experimental and play. And I think that is kind of like a way to attend to what we'd been looking at through the records was a really interesting way to engage with that.
I mean, I think the other thing that was really powerful was the embodying. So this idea of art, allowing the body to come in somewhere into this whole kind of, because we did get, I certainly felt it into quite a bit of headspace at one point, because obviously this stuff is very, very heavy and it makes you think a lot about histories, past, exploitation, really difficult stories, and allowing that space for the body through art to come in, and for us to relax and just kind of, you know, flow in a way, and not just be in that headspace trying to work out our arguments and work out what's the angle and what's the history saying, what's the fact say. I thought that was really, really powerful in what was achieved over that weekend.
Yeah, and just to speak to that actually, because I think the invitation as adults to move into play can seem like somewhat of a daunting prospect. You know, like part of us wants to do that. And then I think there's a part of us that doesn't know how. And maybe because that part has been so straitjacketed for so long, the invitation might be there, but there can be some resistance. And I think in an ideal world, it would be really nice to have the opportunity to hold space for that play, for that to be an extended opportunity, because I don't think it's that easy to be given some materials and said and be told like, here, you know, just play, just make a mess. And it's like, oh, but aren't you going to tell us what to do? You know, aren't you going to show us how to do it? And, you know, I think there can be some resistance to knowing how to go about that. But yeah, as you said, you know, it can engage the body and also the imagination as well. Yeah.
And perhaps this next question then kind of speaks to that a bit, but someone in the Q&A has asked if you have any thoughts on how we might encourage younger people, the next generation, to care about archives, personal and community histories. I think we all might have ideas on this.
Yeah, why don't either of you jump in
Well,
there?
I think young people are more engaged with their histories and storytelling than we are sometimes. I mean, you only have to look at who's at the forefront of certain movements and who can really utilize those kind of artistic practices to make statements. And I think young people are actually in some ways more in tune with that. I think if we're thinking from a more traditional side of education, that story becomes a bit more complicated. But for me, I think young people can really tap into that a lot quicker and maybe with less trepidation and anxiety. I'm not sure. What do you think, Iqbal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right, but as I say, I think picking up again on Michelle's point, the straitjackets, the kind of boxes that we're put into, the kind of pressures that are put on children and young people as much as adults, I think that's where Michelle's invitation and the work around the golden thread and this kind of practice allows us at whatever stage we're at to really think about getting out of just that box, that headspace, and to think about the connections not only with others but with ourselves. So I think there's something very powerful in that, that's both for young and old.
Yeah, and just thinking aloud here, kind of just riffing off of your answers, it's really interesting, this idea of modernity, because in many respects with social media and like the internet, people have got platforms for their voices in places where you had to go through somebody in order to have a voice. You'd have to go to a publisher perhaps in order to have a voice, whereas nowadays there's an accessibility that's available. But what I would say is that with that accessibility, sometimes it can be there can be a censorship as to like how we're going to be received by people. But then there could also be that thing of, that cancel culture, that if I say the wrong thing, then I'm going to be cancelled. So like it can be this fear around it. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the younger generations. But one of the things is I think that there's an opportunity for sharing to be more readily accessible. It's just whether or not that voice is going to become shut down out of fear, or whether it becomes stilted to be a palatable voice,
Mm. Yeah, and I think it also, again, for me, I'm just thinking as you're speaking as well about the kind of diversity of roles, what it means to work in an archive or to history or community histories. Those roles and organisations are incredibly diverse in their practice. And I think so often a historian or a researcher might look and act and appear in a certain way, but I would really encourage young people that is not the case. And yeah, creativity is, I think, something that more and more we're realizing the state that it has had and continues to have in history making more generally. I want to just touch on this last question before we round off. Stephen has asked, again, quite a complex question, but we'll go for it. How do rich responses to official records, such as this, become a resource, a legacy that is not just captured, but exists as a legacy trail or tale away or to the archival accounts? So I guess he's thinking there about legacy, how these kind of projects don't just become a nice thing, a nice moment, but maybe can become quite impactful.
Yeah, again, I think this is a question for you and Iqbal.
Yeah, I think this is partly why I prefaced it with our Archives in Emotions strand of work. I think it's really, really important that this work is not being done in isolation. Michelle reminded me as you were preparing for today's talk that, when we did the weekend, I again gave a preface right at the beginning, really saying this is part of a much bigger program of work that we're developing to really invite the emotions and really take on this notion of the emotional turn, the archival turn, the idea that archives are not just these places where historians and fact seekers turn up, but actually these are places where artists, creatives, the non-professional, quote unquote, a person from the street, as it were, coming in, just wanting to engage in some story. And there are always going to be gaps, there's going to be elisions, there's going to be missing bits. And so I think in many ways, this practice that Michelle is part of is just giving us all a reminder of what's possible. I mean, we certainly are capturing her work on blog services. We are obviously working with lots of different groups. Wherever we can publish, we're talking about it. And I think we're contributing to that wider kind of dialogue and discussion that I think is vital to kind of really capitalize in a right way, as it were, on this extraordinary moment where people have in some ways really picked up that actually there are feelings and emotions that really do not only kind of aside things, but are very core to who our beings are. And so I think that, yeah, there are the outputs, but then there's also these outcomes. And these outcomes are very much longer lasting. And Archives in Emotions strand, the National Archives is now helping to lead on, I think, is key in making sure that all these different practices are sort of supported and looked at and shared.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And yeah, we are definitely, I think the work that both Iqbal and myself have been involved in has kind of been building on momentum of years of work and really responding to the kind of diverse needs of audiences and people that come through the building, and also taking a more creative and expansive understanding of how we might meet people in those needs, especially when we're thinking about something like the Golden Thread, which really kind of enmeshed the artistic practice led by Michelle with that therapeutic angle, and then bringing in the historic specialisms that we could bring as people that engage with the collection itself a lot. And I think those kind of interdisciplinary projects with communities and with groups of people are really where something productive and generative can happen. And thinking about legacy in that can be quite challenging. But for me, I think it's about kind of, I guess, the slow work of that, and not pinning us into this evaluation or this like outcome, but more thinking about a long-term relationship. Certainly we would think of the way that well-being and health is being discussed in terms of social prescribing and things like that. I'm really interested in moving forward. I'm going to round off now and close us out. I hope that's okay with everyone. I hope we've given you some food for thought this afternoon. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us in that and for providing some insight.
Can I just read a really brief quote from British mythologist and storyteller Martin Shaw? He says, "When a culture is in crisis, any form of antidote does not come from the center. It comes from the edges." And there's something that I love about that, is that, you know, it reframes again that linearity, and that we look around the edges and we bring things in. Yeah.
I love that picture, and it kind of decenters ourselves as well in that, which is really helpful, I think, and encouraging. If you're interested in knowing more about the collections that we've spoken today, referenced throughout, we have put together a resource that contains the documents that we displayed as part of the Golden Thread. So that's coming your way via your email, so please do look out for that. If you'd like to read more about the Golden Thread, there is a blog that kind of covers some of the themes we've spoken about today. That's on our website, and the link will be shared in the chat. And just some quick plugs moving forward. If you've enjoyed today's methodology session, there's one more event that might be interesting for you. On Monday, the 11th of November, we'll be hearing from Sarah Ellis, the Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they're going to be sharing with us how digital research can inform creativity, and how the RSC, which is the first performing arts organisation to be granted independent research organisation status, are continuing to navigate the intersections of performance and technologies to enhance engagement with Shakespeare, considering audiences of the future and all of that good stuff. A little plug from me as well. If you're interested in the history of the Thames, we have a Being Human event on the 7th of November between 3 and 7. Come and look at our original documents at the National Archives. We'd love to see you there. If you'd also like to give us some feedback from today, topics that you loved, anything that might help us improve this offer, please take a few minutes to complete our post-event survey, which will be emailed to you soon. That being said, we do hope that you've enjoyed hearing from us today, and that you've been inspired by this series, considering how different kinds of practice might provide new perspectives, and to reflect on how we might respond to archives and collections in creative ways, and perhaps be encouraged to embark on your own research journey. So thank you for joining us. That's it from me, Chloe, and I'll leave it to the others to sign off, and then we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.